All right, good. I had brought this up last class a little bit, just very briefly at the end. It's a very actually quite deep and difficult and thorny topic, and I'm just going to try to sketch out just a couple of the key points that I see as being important for thinking about this issue. Um, just as with any environmental policy, the only reason there's a need for sorry, the only reason there's a need for government intervention is because there are external effects from our actions. There's externalities. There's market failures. Those are the things that justify um, intervening in some way to affect what would normally be private market outcomes. It's kind of the same principle here. So um, as an individual, we make trade-offs all the time between our consumption today versus our consumption in the future. We're always making decisions about saving up for things, or maybe expecting that we're going to have more money in the future, so we borrow against that future income and sort of bring some of that back to the present in order to smooth out our consumption over time. We make decisions about how to do that, and we use um, the market interest rates to kind of help inform those decisions. Um, the market interest rate, in some sense, uh, is a price. It's a price for the timing of money. It's a price, when the interest rate is high, that can induce people to say, well, I was going to maybe consume this now, but because this interest rate's high, I can put this money aside and actually consume a lot more in the future. And so, people who maybe would have consumed now are incentivized to save a little bit more as a result of seeing a higher interest rate. Similarly, if businesses are on the other side of that equation, where they're making decisions about how much to invest and the cost of funds, and if interest rates are high, that's something that could maybe disincentivize them from investing. They might say, it's if we borrow this money now to make this investment, we have to pay a lot back right now. Maybe we'll wait on this investment until interest rates drop. So there's always those sorts of decisions being made all the time in the marketplace. And typically we think about, in any sort of environmental policy, those prices being efficient if we have perfect markets, if there's perfect markets for all commodities, if there's perfect information, if there are no externalities, if there is no market power, then those market prices tell you something about those intertemporal trade-offs. One of the reasons to make a distinction between, for example, a market interest rate and say a social discount rate or a social interest rate, the reason you'd make a distinction between those two and maybe choose a separate social discount rate, which would be different than the market interest rate, is basically the same rationale as you would intervene in any sort of place where there's a market failure. Is that you observe that there's factors that are not being taken into account through the market, and using some of your knowledge of those situations, you can choose parameters that will sort of nudge the outcomes closer to what would be more efficient overall once some of those external effects or information asymmetries are taken into account. So it's the same rationale as for any sort of situation where there's market failure. We're just sort of translating that case to this situation where there's intertemporal decisions having to be made. So the government is constantly making decisions about things that are going to affect consumption profiles. So I'm using this word, consumption profile, just as a term to indicate how much is available for consumption to people at different points in time. Anytime the government is spending now, or enacting a stimulus package now, that's affecting our ability to consume today. Inevitably, that's going to affect our ability to consume in the future. And so those those policies, those government policies, are going to influence that consumption profile. And the question then just becomes, how do we look at those alternative consumption profiles? Maybe one of those scenarios is low consumption now, high consumption in the future. Maybe one of those profiles is some consumption now, an equal amount of consumption in the future. There's different an infinite number of combinations of different amounts for present and future consumption. And to make an evaluation of those consumption profiles, it's necessary to assign some weights to those different values, and that's what this discounting framework does. Is it assigns weights to those values. Just as we do in looking at regular markets, prices give you some information about the values of things to society. And so in making this choice of choosing between consumption today versus tomorrow, we don't want it to be completely independent of what people naturally do in terms of making that trade-off themselves. We would like it to be grounded somewhat in what we observe about people's willingness to forego some consumption now in exchange for some consumption in the future, or maybe get some consumption now and sacrifice some consumption in the future. That's going to inform our choice of what a good social discount rate is. But again, it's not going to, the market rate's not going to capture everything, because of the fact that there's some of those missing elements, that just as there are missing elements in terms of different parties being left out of market transactions. So for, in a pollution example, when there's pollution of water quality that affects downstream users, when there's pollution that affects those downstream users are not part of the market transaction. They're being sort of excluded from the market transaction. Just as there are parties who are not able to express their preferences for different allocations of resources. That's the case of a factory producing something which has a pollutant byproduct. It sells that product to somebody else who buys it, but there could be a third party that's having to deal with the pollution. That party is not directly involved in that market transaction. And that's why we try to correct that stuff. The analogy here for this time discounting would be, you have people that could be affected by a policy that actually aren't born yet. And so that introduces an interesting wrinkle into the analysis, where, just as you have people that are not able to express their preferences for, say, the amount of pollution that's being emitted as a result of a private market transaction between two separate parties, just as those third parties are omitted, there's a lot of third parties who would be affected, who would either be the beneficiaries or on the receiving end of some harm as a result of policies today, who are not around today to express those preferences. And so the correction that we'd like to make for choosing an appropriate social discount rate is going to, in some sense, be advocating on behalf of some of those people that are not able to express their preferences in today's market, because they're not living persons today, so they don't have the ability to vote or go into the market and make purchases or sales to show how much they'd be willing to pay. They can't be surveyed. You can't do a contingent valuation survey on someone who hasn't been born. And so that's where some of these failures of the private market interest rates, that's where some of the failures of the private market interest rates come into play when we're trying to consider trade-offs over longer periods of time. This is something I've just said. We observe people all the time making decisions about deferring consumption today in exchange for consumption later on. That's what's happening when people put money aside for retirement. They are doing so with some regard for the market interest rate, the rate at which that money is going to grow and become larger. If they put it aside and put it in a fund and have it grow and then be able to withdraw it later on. That's a single individual making a intertemporal trade-off directly for themselves. But again, because of the fact that there's people who are affected by the decisions today who aren't able to express their preferences, we might want to consider some other sort of framework other than just purely using the market rates of interest. So there's, I think the best way to think about this, there's actually, it's almost 100 years old now. There's a paper back in 1928 by Frank Ramsey, who was a really influential economist, especially relative to how long he lived. He didn't have a very long life. I believe he passed away in his 30s, but he wrote 3 different really important economics papers. One of them is this optimal growth paper. There was another one on optimal taxation. So he's had a big influence on the field of economics, especially given how little time he had to do so. But one of his contributions was developing just a framework for thinking about optimal consumption and production decisions and optimal savings decisions over time. I'm not going to go over the details of this model in too much depth. I'll describe it a little bit just to say that this is a model in which there's output that can either be, this is a very aggregate model. There's only sort of the unit of analysis is the economy as a whole. There's production that can be made given the existing, the existing capital stock, and that capital stock is going to produce output. And then the choice is just basically very simple. Do you consume some of that output now, or how much do you consume now, and how much do you set aside in order to give yourself the opportunity to increase future output? So that's the basic setting. It's very much a 30,000 foot view of the economy. There's just one economy that's deciding collectively how much to consume now versus to set aside for the future. When you consume now, that's going to increase your utility right now. You enhance well-being right now. But if you save, you're able to consume more later on. That's going to increase the overall utility later on. And then again, there comes this question of how do you judge between these different consumption profiles? You have maybe a smaller amount of consumption today trading off for a larger consumption later on as a result of the growth process. How do you evaluate different amounts of those? And that's what this discounting, the social discount rate comes in. And so I'm going to just go over I had introduced this briefly last class, but the social discount rate is going to be composed in this framework that Frank Ramsey came up with, and which has held up over time because of its generality and because of its, I think, very wide applicability to any sorts of savings and investment problems and any sorts of social trade-off problems when you're thinking about trade-offs over time. The framework that Ramsey had sort of outlined here is that there's a social discount rate, and that's going to be, I'm going to denote that by this parameter S. And there's 2 different versions of it. If you're following along in the readings, there's the EPA guidelines, chapter 6, which talks about this issue of discounting. Boardman, chapter 10, also talks about this issue of discounting. And there's, both of these have the same framework, but there's different notation. So I just wrote down the notation for each of these here. This first column, either this Greek letter rho on top, this is a rho, or this parameter D, both of those represent just something about the pure rate of time preference, which is, I like to think of it just simply as an impatience parameter. How impatient are you? that makes some sense as an individual. Definitely, you can think about as an individual, you'd rather have some stuff today as opposed to in the future. It starts to break down a little bit when you think about extremely long periods of time when you're considering um, the welfare of people today versus the welfare of people 100 years from now who are not born yet, and none of the people today are going to be alive 100 years from now, or at least they'll be very old um, in 100 years. But the first parameter, this rho or this D, is the pure rate of time preference, which just for an individual, this would sort of tell you how much more you prefer to have something now versus the future. Of course, that's true for all of us. We prefer things now rather than having to wait. Not entirely. There's some degree of sacrifice we'd be willing to make today for a payoff in the future. But given equal amounts, we'd prefer to have it now rather than in the future. And so that's what this first parameter represents, is that pure rate of time preference. And then the second parameter is a product of two things. G is used to denote the growth rate of the economy. And then either eta, if you're looking at the EPA guidelines, this Greek letter eta is what's being used to denote the marginal elasticity of utility with respect to income. Let me just write that out. Eta or E, rate at which marginal utility decreases with income. So we have some intuition about, an extra dollar is worth a little bit less to you the more money you have. This parameter just captures exactly how much less is it. I'll return to that in one moment. Let me just recap here that the social discount rate is the sum of this pure rate of time preference, and the other term is the product of the elasticity of utility with respect to income, and G is the growth rate of the economy. The important thing to note here is that there's some growth, there's some level of economic growth that is going to persist over time. When you're thinking about trade-offs between now and the future, one important thing to keep in mind is that, if you put yourself back in the place of somebody 100 years ago, an average citizen of the United States was somewhere between, 5 and 8 times poorer 100 years ago than they are today. And so if you think about what the optimal policy would be for them in say 1920, how much should they save in order to benefit people today? Well, some, of course, you want them to save and invest, and we've been the beneficiaries of that investment. You'd want them to do things to protect the environment and maintain the national capital stock. But if you're thinking about welfare of individuals today versus 1920, you might argue that the people in 1920 were far too generous in terms of how much they saved, because we're enjoying a standard of living 5 to 8 times higher on average than they did, and so having them save is going to benefit us, but we're already much richer, and so it's a question of how much more richer do you want to make people in the future relative to us now, who are inevitably we're going to be a lot poorer than people who are alive 100 years from now, just based on the natural rate of economic growth that's been chugging along for 150 years, around 2% or 3% in the United States economy. So that's one of the considerations in this model, is the fact that this pattern that we observe, which has happened pretty steadily, pretty consistently over a century or more. If this continues, then we'd expect the people that we're thinking about in the future these future people that aren't born yet are going to actually have a lot more stuff than we have now, and that should be taken into account in some sense when we're evaluating trade-offs between policies that are going to have differential effects on these people. So let me just explain what this just a little bit more about this elasticity parameter. Let me explain. So if this is equal to 1, let's say that we set this equal to 1. Here's what that means. What that means is that let's say average income today is 40,000, and let's consider a 10% decrease in that income today. So let's say we put aside $4,000 per person today. That's a 10% that's a 10% reduction. Let's say this is now. Let's say in some future period. It's unclear exactly when this is going to be, but let's just say that in the future, average income would be 80,000. If this elasticity parameter is equal to 1, what that implies is that this $4,000 drop in income, which represents a 10% decrease in income now, this parameter being equal to 1 implies that this would be equivalent to an $8,000 increase in income in the future. Essentially what this means is you have to have trade-offs over time that represent equal increases or decreases in percentages of income. So this would represent an increase from 80,000 to 88,000 would represent a 10% increase in your income. It's a larger dollar amount, but because we're richer in the future, we have $80,000 per person per year. It's going to require at least $8,000 of extra income in the future to make up for this $4,000 drop, which can be just represented by some policy that in a general sense is like a social saving. You're giving up some resources today. Maybe you're putting forth some policies to reduce climate change. That's going to make people a little bit poorer now. There's going to be higher prices for energy now. People's real income is going to fall as a result of that. But you're going to be increasing people's future income. And this marginal elasticity of income parameter sort of is a choice that says that equal percentage reductions result in equal utility. So a 10% decrease now is equivalent to a 10% increase in the future. That's a fair trade-off if this elasticity parameter is equal to 1. So if this future income was only, if this was only $4,000 increase, if this was a movement from 80,000 just to 84,000, then this would not be as much. This would not be a valuable social trade-off. 4,000 now for an increase of 4,000 in the future. That would not be equivalent to. That would not be an equivalent trade-off, or not be a worthwhile trade-off at an elasticity of 1. At an elasticity of 1, it would require that this $4,000 hit that we're taking now would have to generate at least $8,000, given that income is twice as high in the future. So that's what this parameter means. So if you think that if this parameter, if you're choosing a parameter here that's greater than 1, that means that a percentage reduction now would have to result in a larger percentage reduction in the future. If a 10% hit now would require a 12 or 15% increase in the future if this parameter is greater than 1. If this parameter is less than 1, then a smaller something smaller than a one-to-one change on a percentage basis would be required to be equivalent. So that's the intuition for that parameter. And again, this is like this is not necessarily something we can observe very readily. We can't measure people's utility of income And so this part is certainly something of a choice on the part of the researcher. All right, so if we just recap, we have rho plus eta plus g. This is the pure rate of time preference. This is the elasticity of utility with respect to income. This is the growth rate. Ultimately, there's different economists over time that have had different philosophies about what these numbers should be. One of the numbers here that's not entirely subjective, that actually is based in part on data, and that's the growth rate. So the last century or so, the United States economy and the United States economy has grown at about 2.3% on an annual basis. So that's one of these parameters that sort of does come out of data. And then these other two are a little bit more subjective, and just to, you can read about some of the different perspectives on this in the Boardman chapter 10 and in the EPA guidelines chapter 6. But I'll just kind of summarize what I think. This is what the Boardman book ultimately sort of comes down with at the end of the day, given that this is such a messy and subjective choice. They recommend something like a 1% pure rate of time preference. There's some debate about whether that should be much closer to 0 or maybe even a little bit higher. 1% seems to be kind of in the middle of some of the different perspectives, where some would say it should be 0.1 or close to 0. There's some that say it should be about 2% or so. So 1% is kind of a reasonable plug-in value for that. And then this elasticity parameter, Boardman again sort of recommends something like 1, and there's debate about whether that should be greater than 1, whether a percentage or whether percentage increases in income are identical, or whether you need more of a percentage increase in the future to account for a percentage decrease today. What these values in red that I've put down here would imply is that there's something like 3.3% is a reasonable midpoint value for a choice for a social discount rate. And then given that, especially this pure rate of time preference parameter and this elasticity of income parameter are somewhat subjective and not directly observable, there's different choices of these could give you some ranges between something like 5% and 2%. Again, these the conceptual foundations for these choices are more philosophical than economic, and so there's not a sense in which we can derive these values based on going out and collecting data about this. This is ultimately a bit of a subjective choice, but the sort of the recommendation is that fit something in between. This 3.3, you can think of this maybe as just 3.5. That could be something like your midpoint, and then you could do some sensitivity analysis by choosing something that's a little bit higher and a little bit lower, which would represent different combinations of low pure rates of time preference and low elasticities of utility. That would low combinations of that could result in something like 2% at the low end, and then higher combinations could result in something like 5%. So that's kind of the recommendation that chapter 10 of the book sort of comes down with, is choose something, within this range, and then do some sensitivity analysis, just because there is a lot of subjectivity involved in some of these choices. So that's, I think, there's a lot more to that you could dig into that. You could dig into that topic forever. It's thorny and uncertain and ambiguous in some sense, but overall these are kind of some reasonable values, and at the end of the day it's going to be a bit of a subjective decision. So the bottom line here, I've provided some rationale, some way to think about this choice of a discount rate. Bottom line, you're going to have to just choose some value for S. Again, because it's such a subjective choice, it's ultimately going to be a choice at the end of the day. The important thing is just to understand a little bit of the conceptual background that I've gone over here. Understand some of the key trade-offs, the key considerations, the key reasons why some sort of social discount rate is desirable. Part of that again is we have, in some sense, it's a way to advocate for people that are not born yet. But whatever you choose, I just say provide some rationale, some justification for the number that you choose, and that's going to be even more important than the number itself is having some understanding of some of these components. Maybe start with this framework. Think about the different components: the pure rate of time preference, the elasticity of income, and the growth rate, and provide some rationale for choosing some reasonable value, and then do some sensitivity analysis. Try something a little bit above what your best guess is, and then try something a little bit below, and look at how your values, your final values of your benefit cost analysis change as those values move up and down. This is going to be especially relevant for projects that have longer lifespan, and depending on your own time profile for benefits and costs. If a lot of your costs are front loaded, but your benefits come into the future, then your results could be particularly sensitive to your choice of social discount rate. If your policies tend to have pretty smooth and pretty even benefits and costs over time, then choosing different discount rates isn't going to change the balance of the evaluation very much. So the degree to which the benefits or costs of your project are sort of bunched up in one time period, if all the costs occur early and the benefits occur late, or vice versa, that bunching of those costs, say early, is going to make the choice of S more consequential. If your benefits or costs are more spread out, then that'll make your choice less consequential. So different projects that have different time profiles of benefits and costs are going to have different degrees to which those projects are sensitive to the values that are chosen. Okay, I want to move on to talk a little bit about cost effectiveness analysis. So this is something that was actually hinted at a little bit in the in last lecture when I introduced distinctions between different kinds of policies. So this is going to be thinking about cost effectiveness. This is going to be a little bit of a different framework than pure benefit cost analysis, because it actually doesn't require that you monetize all the values. one of the advantages of this strategy or this approach is that you can leave some outputs of the project in just the original units that they came in. So this does not require the total monetization. And strict benefit cost analysis does require that all of the relevant benefits and costs are converted into monetary values. So costs of deaths or deaths avoided, or illness, those things are converted into monetary values and put on a ledger. This cost effectiveness analysis approach actually doesn't require that. Either the analyst may not find it appropriate to do that monetization. It might be somewhat crass, or they might think it's just inappropriate in some cases to do that monetization. Or maybe the client that you're doing the analysis for doesn't want that. They would prefer not to have everything be monetized. But even if you don't put everything in monetary values, there's still some objective criteria that you can use to evaluate different policies, where some of the values will be in monetary values. So the costs of whatever you're thinking about, those are measured in terms of money. And then whatever the objectives are, your effectiveness that's going to be measured in terms of whatever your objectives are. So if your goal is to minimize the number of excess deaths, or minimize the number of excess hospitalizations that are going to occur over the course of time, say if COVID-19 is naturally running its course in the economy in a business as usual scenario. If your goal is to measure and evaluate policies that reduce that, rather than maybe converting those monetary, or converting those health outcomes, either the illness or death, rather than converting those to monetary values, you might simply put those measures of avoided deaths, or avoided hospitalizations. Those might be in the denominator. You might, rather than converting those to monetary terms, you might put these terms in the denominator, and then just put cost in the numerator. And in that sense, so you'd have cost divided by number of lives saved. Basically, this could be some measure of excess deaths that are avoided relative to a business as usual, excess deaths that are avoided as a result of some stricter containment policy. And so this would be cost per per life saved. And if you're not wanting to be in the business of and certainly I'm thankful that I'm not the person that is making some of these decisions and having to pit these two different very intense negative outcomes against one another of monetary costs, of economic value that's being destroyed, people's incomes that are being destroyed, people's 401ks that are being destroyed, people being unemployed and becoming depressed, having to pit those and put those in monetary terms relative to the value of somebody contracting the virus and not surviving as a result of that. That's an impossible decision to make. One alternative framework you could use is think about, okay, maybe we want to not monetize deaths, but maybe we think about capping, or to the best of our ability, putting an upper limit on the excess deaths that are going to occur from this disease outbreak. Let's say maybe 100,000 or 200,000 lives is as much as we're willing to give up as a society for that outcome. That doesn't require you to put those in monetary terms, but you can consider then, given that target, given some target for lives saved, you can evaluate the effectiveness of different policies according to how costly they are. How much other sorts of resources will you have to give up to reach that target? Again, there's a lot of uncertainty, but to the extent that you can have a best estimate for the number of lives saved, you could evaluate policies based on how costly they achieve this objective. I sort of hinted at this a little bit here with this formula. This would just be, the dollar cost in the numerator, and then the denominator, again, just to stress this point, this denominator is not monetized. It's merely a measure of some outcome, whatever outcome you're interested in. You could think about this also in terms of achievement on overall achievement on standardized tests for a school district. So a school district might have some target for say mean test scores or median test scores for the children that are being schooled in that district. And you might think about different policies that have different costs, maybe increasing the number of teachers per classroom, or reducing the number of students per classroom, or student teacher ratios, or using certain technologies, or using particular sort of pedagogical strategies. Different policies of that nature could have different costs, as well as different incremental improvements in the objective that you're interested in. So we have these objectives. The measure of cost effectiveness in this case, we could think about strategy in general. In general, we could think about strategy, just strategy I and strategy J. We could think of the costs of strategy I, and we could think of the costs of strategy J. So this would be some measure of relative costs. Basically this would be the relative or incremental costs, right? That's so the numerator here for this I'm gonna call this a cost effectiveness ratio. The numerator is the incremental costs of basically, strategy J is going to have some cost. Maybe these are both measured relative to business as usual, or relative to the status quo. Strategy J is going to have some cost associated with it. Strategy I will have some other cost associated with it. And then you have some outcome, some effectiveness. So this could be like, maybe J, if we go back to that school district example, where a school district is trying to figure out how much to spend on different school designs or school policies. This would be maybe strategy J could be like current expenditure, and then the strategy I would be the new expenditure that would be required under under some alternative school design or spending regime. And then the effectiveness, we would have the effectiveness of I over the, or subtracted from the, this is the relative or incremental improvement in outcomes. And then again, this EJ would be, let's say current test scores or current achievement as measured by test scores. There's some index that measures retention or learning. And then this would be the new achievement. So this new student achievement under that new strategy, that would indicate some measure of the extra retention or extra student learning that's occurring as a result of that policy. And you could think about, okay, this represents some ratio of incremental dollars spent and the incremental achievement or incremental additional achievement that students are getting. So that could be some value there, and then maybe you could do that for policy K, and maybe take policy K. Think about this in terms of instead of evaluating C sub I, maybe you could evaluate C sub K or relative to J, and do that calculation and see which of those strategies, I or K, gives you more or gives you the cheapest incremental improvement in achievement, something like that. One way to think about this in terms of the current health crisis that we're in, if we think about we could think about this maybe this x-axis representing deaths that are avoided. So there's some baseline deaths that would occur under business as usual, but we're able to avoid some of those with some quarantine policies or some testing regimes. On this axis, we could think about these as being the costs, or specifically the foregone output, right? And so there's maybe some level of avoided deaths that you can achieve, with just maybe a light quarantine. So just having a few weeks or maybe 1 month of quarantine avoids a certain number of deaths. Maybe this is you avoid like something like 500,000 deaths with just a light quarantine. But maybe you'd prefer to avoid something like 1 million deaths. We could consider a couple different policies that could, maybe one of them, I'm going to say A is maybe just to put some concreteness. A would be a short quarantine. B would be longer quarantine, but no additional testing. And then maybe C would be kind of a medium length quarantine, but with testing, and have it be more of a targeted quarantine. I'm not writing that down very well here. Maybe we have these different policies that we're evaluating. A would be just kind of a couple weeks or maybe a 1 month quarantine. Maybe we save some lives that way. And we're considering maybe alternative policies B and C, which could have different amounts of costs. So C in this case would be a policy that still saves just as many lives as policy B, which is a longer quarantine, but it's going to cost a lot less because you're able to specifically allow people into the population again, allow people going back to work who are testing negative. And so that policy could have much lower costs than an alternative where everybody is just quarantined for that period of time. Everybody staying quarantined could save quite a few lives, given that it could stem the spread of the virus. But there could be a way of saving equal number of lives, perhaps, if there's testing going on and the quarantine is just done on a more targeted basis. And so this would be an example, maybe in our current situation, where we wouldn't necessarily have to be choosing between different numbers of lives versus foregone economic output. We could decide, this million deaths avoided number. This is something that we want to achieve. We're going to try to achieve that. Now the question is, given our alternatives, would we rather have, something that's going to be much more costly or less costly? So that's just one application, perhaps, of how this cost effectiveness framework could be particularly useful in the current environment, where it's not particularly tasteful to be thinking about these trade-offs explicitly, but certainly it's not distasteful to think about, how could we achieve, a certain outcome that we wanted, a certain health outcome, while giving up as few resources as possible. And that's one way that this cost effectiveness analysis could be really really applicable in this current environment. Okay. Sienna says it's all good. Thank you, Sienna, for coming today, joining me in this in my house. Okay, thanks guys. I'll see you on Thursday.